Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Robert Garland about his book titled What to Expect When You're Dead, an Ancient Tour of Death and the Afterlife, published by Princeton University Press in 2025. As the book suggests, as the title suggests, we're going to be going across a whole range of ancient cultures and traditions to understand what people thought in this ancient period around dying, death, the afterlife, what the living should do with the dead. It turns out there's a whole bunch of different things that are interestingly similar between different cultures, and of course some quite specific things in different times and places as well. So as much as this is obviously a book about death, I think we're going to have a rather lively conversation about it, just like the book does itself. So Robert, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Miranda. And I'm delighted to be here today.
I'm delighted to have you. Could you please start us off by introducing yourself a little bit and tell us why you decided to write this book?
Yes, I'm emeritus professor from Colgate University in upstate New York, although I'm British, as you can probably tell from my accent. I got interested in death really at the age of about 8 or 9 when I first went to the British Museum with my parents, and I came into contact with Ginger. That is to say, a mummy. He's now named EA32751 for ethical reasons, as they put it, because it's not appropriate to refer to a person's physical appearance. But I was so struck by him when I looked into the case, and though I didn't have any sense of what 3,500 BCE meant at that time, nonetheless, I realized that this person was very old, and yet he looked also very intact. So that was my first encounter with death, so to speak. And I've always been interested in the subject, which I've never found in the slightest bit depressing for some reason. In fact, as you mentioned in your introduction, I think death is a lively subject because it makes us more aware of the value of being alive. And that's something which I've tried to convey in the book by adopting what I hope is a fairly light-hearted attitude towards what might be considered to be a heavy undertaking, if you'll forgive the pun, which, as I've said, I don't really think it to be. So that was my beginning, as it were. And in fact, when I was doing my PhD at University College London, that was on Greek, the Greek way of death. And I've just sort of increased my interest across cultures as I've aged myself, so to speak.
And ended up with a whole bunch of different things in this book. So thank you for that introduction, and definitely worth flagging to listeners that despite the range of practices we're going to be discussing, this is not an 800-page book. It's quite readable in tone, as you mentioned, but also in terms of scale. And to be honest, I found that pretty surprising when the book arrived, because given the ancient tour of death and the afterlife as the subtitle, I was kind of amazed as a historian by how you could fit all these things into a book without it being 800 pages. So before we get into any of the particular beliefs, can you tell us about how you organized and sort of scoped the book and decided what to focus on and therefore inevitably what to leave out?
As you said, it's about many cultures. It's not simply about the classical world, which is where I began my interest in death. I later became interested in Egyptian. I taught both early Christian and Hebrew texts, also taught the Quran. So I had a kind of a background in many of these cultures, but I felt that I wanted to write a book that would be both useful to the scholar, so I've got all those footnotes at the end, but also primarily really for the general reader. I admire books, and indeed any scholars, who think that their subject has to be of importance for people outside their discipline. And when I was studying for my PhD, I remember I encountered someone at lunchtime who asked me about my interest. And when I said it was about Greek burial rites, he said, "So what?" In other words, what's the point of learning all this stuff? So over the years, I've tried to make the kind of work I've done have some appeal to people who knew nothing about the subject. And this subject especially, I feel, might appeal to people who are non-specialists. So I wrote it with a sense that it was both, well researched on the one hand, but also in a style that would make it readable. And as you say, it could have been 800 or more pages in length. So I inevitably have had to be very selective. But at the same time, I'd like to believe that I've got some essential ideas across which anybody would want to have some answers to if they were interested in the ancient world, or indeed if they were interested in what happens when you die, which I think is always at the back of one's mind somehow from the age of whatever it might be onwards. So although this is not a self-help book, so to speak, the idea is that it would be kept within limits so that it would certainly have appeal, as I say, for the general reader. And I did choose to have nothing to say about grief. I thought that that was a subject which, anyway, I was not prepared to obviously make light of, whereas the tone of the book throughout is one of, I think, I would like to say at any rate, one of real sort of joy about some of the funny things that people say about the belief in the afterlife, and also the sense that, as I mentioned before, that we're alive, we're not dead, and this makes us appreciate the fact all the more by studying thoughts about the afterlife.
Yeah, it's those thoughts about the afterlife that I'd like to go to first. And because, as you said, we are currently alive, and yet there is always that thought in the back of one's head, in the back of sort of society's head about death. And so all these different cultures that you examine have ideas around sort of how to achieve a quote unquote good death.
Yes. Yes,
what
indeed.
were those ideas, and were there similarities across different times and places in terms of what that was understood to be?
Well, I think to begin with, there's always the sense that you want to leave your belongings, your property, your estate to someone. I mean, we know that that was already something that concerned the ancient Egyptians. And there's a wonderful letter which a mother of 8 writes. Her name is Naunakte, in which she disinherits her bad sons in favor of her good sons. And that, to me, when I read that letter, I thought, well, that's so absolutely just without any kind of difference from today, from what it was like then. So preparing for the afterlife, getting ready to die, I think from early times, maybe back as far as Neolithic, and the book does actually begin with Neolithic ideas, possibly, about the afterlife. You would leave perhaps your jawbone or something or other to your favored child, as it might be. So I think that's the first thing. And of course, we read in the book of Genesis, the Bekora, that is to say, that between Isaac and Esau, a conflict, of course, and Isaac manages to claim the Bekora illegitimately from his father, Abraham, because the firstborn got double inheritance. Julius Caesar says the best way to die is unexpectedly. That is what Plutarch tells us the night before his death, when he's dining with his master of horses, unaware, of course, of what awaits him on the Ides of March the next day. Unexpectedly is perhaps the best way to die, but even so, you want to make adequate provision beforehand. There's a lovely story that I always think sums up the Greek view of what is the best way to die, which Herodotus tells about 2 sons called Cleobis and Biton. They performed a great service for their mother by dragging a cart with her in it to a festival of Hera when the oxen did not return in time to perform that service for her. And she prayed to Hera what would be the best way for them to die. And they never woke up after having fallen asleep at night. In other words, they had a completely painless death. And that, of course, is something as well that we all think is the best way to go. No one wants to go prolonged in agony, which I think would have been relatively rare in the ancient world, since there were no means really to prolong life, as of course there is today.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense in terms of what kind of medical care is or is not available, leading to some commonalities. What about then after one dies? Hopefully in those kind of, quote, good ways that you've just mentioned. How much did it cost to die?
What a great question. I looked up what it total global market for death care services was in 2020. It amounts to 140 billion pounds worldwide. I think that it obviously varied greatly. I mean, if you're going to erect a pyramid, then we're talking about a very large outlay. And indeed, again, according to the society that we're talking about, there would have been great differences. Ginger, whom I mentioned, was buried in the bare sand, probably in a matting of some kind, with a few objects beside him, pots, perhaps containing food, because he was expected perhaps to resurrect in the afterlife. Relatively cheap. But of course, in Egypt generally, it would have been extremely expensive to prepare for death. There were so many items that you had to pay for. You had to pay for instance, your coffin. And there's a wonderful coffin in the Brooklyn Museum, which belongs to a man called Teti. And on the side of the notice about the coffin, it says that this would have cost Teti the equivalent of a whole year's salary, or a whole year's whatever it was that you needed to get through a whole year. And that makes me think that if you had been living in ancient Egypt, you would have been under tremendous pressure to pay not only for your anthropoid coffin, but for mummification, for the building of a tomb, for the painting of the tomb, and perhaps even afterwards to have priests to bring you food and drink if you didn't wholly trust that your relatives would do that. And that made me think that, okay, Teti must have foregone a nice trip down the Nile, say, in favor of building himself adequately a house of eternity, as it was called, with all the necessary appurtenances. And when, that's not including all the personal objects that would have gone into it. So it makes me think that in ancient Egypt, beginning with ancient Egypt, that the cost of preparing for the afterlife was enormous and must have been an expenditure that would have crippled many households. Now, on the other hand, people who could not do that, and they were undoubtedly the majority, would have been buried in a communal burial place with just that matting that poor old Ginger probably had to keep him warm. In other societies, I think the costs were less, with the exception of Rome. I'll come to that in a second. In Greece, for instance, in the classical period, people were interred in the ground, and very few objects were buried with them other than a choice set of pottery that you would use for the drinking party, the symposium. And it's those pots that have survived in great quantity and in perfect condition in many cases because they were buried. Many of them exported to Etruria. But in general, it would have been relatively inexpensive, certainly compared with Egypt. When we moved to Rome, the sky was the limit. There was no limit on what you could pay, what you were required to pay, whereas there was in Greece, incidentally. You had to, from the 4th century onwards, you had to have a very simple grave marker. Grave markers are a slightly different area of expense, but of course many people want to be remembered by having an elaborate tomb in a prominent place, and these would have been very costly. So it would have, the long story short, is a vast variety in the kind of cost that could be expected for the deceased or their relatives to pay, with at the top end astronomical fees being paid out, and at the bottom end really very minimum, with for instance, burial societies, which you would join rather like joining a club, or play any kind of game or sporting activity, and you would pay every month, and in return, when you were buried, you wouldn't have to fork out, or your heirs wouldn't have to fork out a great sum of money, because that was all included, as it were, in the monthly cost. These were very popular, by the way, in both the Hellenistic period following the death of Alexander the Great, and indeed in the Roman period. And Roman soldiers as well would belong to burial societies. So there were all kinds of ways in which you could halve the cost or make it much smaller. And incidentally, just a note that I found out very recently, that the cheapest coffin available is £44 in this country at this point, and it is what's called a wood lock coffin. But of course, there's always pressure upon relatives not to go for the cheapest economy option. And I'm sure that would have been the case also in antiquity.
Oh, I'm not switching my team to some fancy work platform that somehow knows exactly how we work. And its AI features are literally saving us hours every day. We're big fans. And just like that, teams all around the world are falling for Monday.com. With intuitive design, seamless AI capabilities, and custom workflows, it's the work platform your team will instantly click with. Head to Monday.com, the first work platform you'll love to use.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
Have you ever spotted McDonald's hot, crispy fries right as they're being scooped into the carton? And time just stands still. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
This is so interesting to hear you talk about, because there's just so many things. There's so many items. There's so many processes. There's so many things to arrange. And yet in all of these instances, speed and properly disposing of the body seem to be such an emphasis kind of what's supposed to happen to a corpse immediately after death. So how does that work? Kind of what was one supposed to do with the corpse, and how did the impetus for speed and doing it properly fit in with also arranging all of these other pieces you've just outlined?
Yes, indeed. I think that, firstly, we have to take into account, of course, for the Mediterranean cultures, which includes, of course, Greece, Rome, and Egypt, Mesopotamia as well. All those cultures were in climates that were going to really affect the way that the body could survive. And mostly what we hear about is that burial had to be very quick. That is to say, within even 24 hours in the case of the Jewish population, and of course, in addition, the Islamic population. But it was also true as well of ancient Greece. Solon, for instance, passed a law which required people to bury within 24 hours. And the reason for this was, as I say, partly, I think, because of an awareness that to put it bluntly, rotting corpse was not something that you wanted to metaphorically have on your hands for too long. But it was also the case, I think, that funerals have always been, still are, of course, opportunities for propaganda, for people to show off and to have elaborate funeral processions and deliver extensive eulogies describing the achievements of the dead. So both, I think, a desire to curtail excessive displays of ostentatiousness, but probably more importantly, to ensure that the body was safely dispatched within an appropriately short period of time. And I think especially of the Egyptians, because, of course, embalming, mummification, is an elaborate process, and you want to get the body underway with that as soon as possible. It had to probably transported from the east bank to the west, which was where most of the embalmers would have been in business. And a modern embalmer is quoted as saying that the best is to get the body being embalmed within an hour after death. Now, that would have been absolutely impossible in ancient Egypt, because it would have taken probably at the very least a few hours for the body to actually reach the embalmers, unless they had some kind of super fast system of doing it, which we know nothing whatsoever about. But many bodies, of course, would have been, if they had not been on the very edge of the Nile, so to speak, perhaps some distance inland. So embalmers would have had to work very fast for that reason as well. The sense of things is, in terms of mummification, daunting to imagine just how rapidly people would have had to, the embalmers would have had to work in order to drain the body of its fluids, etc., before, to put it crudely, putrefaction set in. So I think that those two reasons operated, both the desire to curtail to some degree, not always in all cultures, but, as far as Greece was concerned, so that aristocrats didn't have the opportunity to sort of trumpet their achievements and therefore cause potential unrest. That was one reason, but predominantly I think it was to do with climate. In Egypt, for instance, it's still 70 degrees sometimes in the winter. And that obviously would have created, as I say, a lot of problems for the embalmers if they didn't get the body pretty darn quick.
Yeah, it definitely speaks to the skill of embalmers. They need to be professionals in order to do that.
Yes.
Were there other kinds of professionals involved in ancient burial practices that we want to discuss?
Well, indeed there were. Although I would say to begin with that in many cultures, it was done by the immediate family. Obviously not in Egypt, because the body would not have resided in the home for any length of time, but in Greece, in Rome, probably in Mesopotamia as well, I think, and in other cultures, it was customary, as it is in our culture, to wash the body and to prepare it for burial and to lay it out in a way that it could be viewed by other members of the family and by friends. A ceremony that was known as the prothesis in Greek, collocatio in Latin, absolutely the same in Roman society. And that would be a time to mourn the dead, just as, for instance, an Irish wake today offers the same opportunity for relatives and friends to come and be with the dead before they undertake their final journey, so to speak. But in addition, there were indeed professionals. We know that there were klimakophoroi in Greek. The word means ladder carriers. They would be the equivalent of the people who come with the hearse, because if, for instance, you want to make a slightly more effective court carrying of the body to the place of interment, then you would want to do this with a horse-drawn chariot and that kind of thing. And this would be organized by these klimakophoroi. The word derives from the fact that a ladder would have been used to transport the body onto the cart, etc. But these are the only professionals that we hear of in Greek society. In Roman society, on the other hand, we hear of a vast variety of people. We hear of polyctores. Now, they're the equivalent of morticians. That is to say, people who would have made the face lipstick and a little bit of pomade or whatever it might be, brush the hair, so that the deceased looked at her or his very best. And we hear of praefikai, singers, mourners, professional mourners whom you would hire to probably weep and sing and so forth. We hear of vespilones, They were the people who carried the body to the place of interment. Their name, Vespilones, comes from Vesper, which is evening time, because the body would be carried out traditionally at evening. We hear of ustores, those are the people who perform the cremation. And we hear of fossores, diggers, the ones who obviously dug the grave. And we know a great deal about the Roman undertaking profession, which I think is fascinating in its own right, because undertakers were persons who were not completely acceptable in Roman society. They could only live outside the city. And if they entered the city to pick up a body, for instance, they had to wear a little red cap. And they were not to be disfigured. They were not to have any blemishes on their body, etc., etc. We hear of this only from a single law code from Pozzuoli, that is to say, Puteoli near Venice, near modern-day Naples. But it's likely, I think, that this kind of regulation was widespread throughout the Roman world. So they were persons apart. And although undertakers today aren't persons apart in the same way, there's still, I think, a certain kind of reserve in relation to undertakers, just as there was, obviously, in the ancient world. Although in their case, I think part of the reason for this was because death was seen as a pollution. That is to say, something which caused people to be under some kind of a religious ban, and therefore not acceptable within the urban area of Rome. So really it's only Rome, and in a different way, Egyptians. Egyptians, by the way, would have had a priest who would have accompanied the body to the place of interment. And again, there might have been professional mourners and some kind of statement made. Oddly, we don't have any funeral service, words of a funeral service that have survived from anywhere in the ancient world, any more than we have words relating to a marriage ceremony either. It's quite likely that this was just an informal statement that was made at the place where the body was finally interred.
That's very interesting to think about what we do and don't have in the record, especially given how detailed some of the things are that we do have. Thinking then about the burial being sort of complete, often in a lot of these cultures, you talk about ideas of the dead going on some kind of sort of final journey. Did this look the same in different places and times?
Yes, I think the idea about a journey goes to the heart of what is done for the dead. There was a very important anthropologist, Arnold Van Gennep, who wrote a path-breaking book in 1919 called Rites of Passage, in which he analyzes and identifies a threefold process, one of separation, one of transition, and one of incorporation, which not only at death, but also at marriage and other significant points in a person's life are replicated. And this I think very, very accurately indicates the process for the dead from one place to another, with the journey that is undertaken, as it were, in the middle, when you are in transition. Because, for instance, if you did not cross the river Styx to Hades, then you were left kind of literally high and dry. And in the Iliad, because Achilles is reluctant to release Patroclus for burial or for cremation, Patroclus, his spirit, appears to him and says, "Bury me as quickly as possible so that I can enter the gates of Hades." So that's very clear there, what he's saying. He's saying, look, I can't be properly dead unless you bury me. So burial is more than simply a way to get rid of a dead body. It's something that actually assists the dead in their transitional moment until they get incorporated into the other world. And I think that is general to many cultures, that burial is both an action for disposing of the body, and it's of assistance to the dead. So we meet the same kind of tripartite structure in other systems of belief as well. But I think it's general that the dead do undertake a journey. For instance, in ancient Egypt, the Book of the Dead, which was placed in the tomb beside the dead, gives instructions to the dead as to how they will make that journey to the broad hall of two truths, as it's called, where they undergo a postmortem judgment. And all the sort of ideas about the kind of monsters that they're going to meet on the way and what to deal with them are laid out. And similarly, in Greek belief, already in the Odyssey, we hear of the dead. Well, first of all, Odysseus travels by ship to the place where he will dig a hole and contact the dead. But when the suitors are killed at the end of the book, they go on what Homer calls the moldy ways to Hades. In other words, there's both a land route and there is a sea route as well. But there's a journey, as you say, that has to be made. And similarly, in Zoroastrian belief, you have to cross the bridge of the separator, as it's called. And if you go successfully, you go one way to a good place, and if not, to a bad place. So the idea, I think, that the dead are not completely dead until they reach the other place, the afterlife, is really very common to most cultures, certainly that I have been able to study. And it makes sense as well, I think, because there is something about, when a person dies, death is not immediate necessarily. There's a sort of sense in which the dead is still there. And that really, with modern science, indicating that there is not necessarily very great clarity when somebody has sustained, the organs have died, but the brain is alive, and so on and so forth. Death is indeed not an event, but a process. And I think that the ancients understood that very well.
Queridos rivales de la carretera, hablemos del significado de extra. Toyota ofrece un montón de extra con Toyota Care, nuestro plan de mantenimiento sin costo por 2 años o 25,000 millas. Cambios de aceite, rotación de llantas y más sin costo. Kia y Ford cobran extra por mantenimiento. Y ese es el tipo de extra que nadie necesita. Esfuércense más. Toyota. Basado en datos de manufactura de la industria a partir del 3/3/2025. Cubre el servicio normal programado de fábrica por 2 años o 25,000 millas, lo que ocurra primero. Visita tu concesionario Toyota para detalles y exclusiones.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Thinking then about the kind of end of this process, as you mentioned, the idea of sort of the dead in many cases being seen to be judged, and then they go here, they go there. What is that here or there? What were the different expectations of what the dead would experience sort of at the end of this process? Did the dead have bodies in the afterlife? Did they work in the afterlife? Or if they were rich in one world, were they rich in the next? Like, how did that thinking work?
Well, those 3 questions that you've just asked, I think, were the ones that almost prompted me to write the book. What would you, if you're one thing in this life, will you be the same status, for instance? What will you be able to do in the next life? Will you actually have a body in the next life? These are questions which provoke me. And of course, I haven't come up with the answer, but I have been fascinated by the kind of answers that the ancients have given. And much depends, of course, as to whether you believe that there are two different afterlives awaiting you, depending on how you have lived in this life. Now, the earliest evidence for this is probably, one might say, Mesopotamian, with the belief in a place called Kur, which is to say a place of darkness, not very nice. Everybody ends up there. Nobody has a chance of anything preferable to the lot of common humanity. And that was the same as well for the Greeks as far as Hades was concerned, at least in Homer's day. In the Odyssey, for instance, everybody goes to Hades. Everybody is miserable. Everybody is stumbling in the dark. There are only three felons who are punished for their gross misdeeds, one of whom is Tantalus, probably the most well-known, who is tantalized by being in a always thirsty, always hungry, and everything recedes from him. He's being tantalized. But the vast majority of people end up in the same place. Egypt, different. Egypt institutes or introduces the negative confession, which means that the deceased has to deny that they have committed various crimes, and if they pass the negative confession, then they will be admitted into the field of reeds, and they'll have a lovely time in the afterlife, living exactly as they do in this life. Presumably not with having to deal with sickness, however. Presumably not having to do with snake bites, etc., although there's no specific evidence to indicate that they didn't. So perhaps it was selected, I don't know. But generally, the afterlife, as far as the Egyptians were concerned, was simply an extension of this life, with people partying and with people hunting. But when I say people, I should actually modify that and say with men partying and with men hunting, because it seems to have been an afterlife that appealed especially to men, that men would be doing the things that men do, whereas women would be doing what? We're not told. And that is somewhat similar, I have to say, to the Islamic view of the afterlife as well, Jannah, which suggests that, again, men will be the ones that this afterlife will fit. They will be lying on couches, fed very nice drinks, etc., etc. So there is a general tendency to see the afterlife as a replica of life on this earth. Now, the other thing to point out, of course, is that what happens if you don't earn the good reward that obviously everybody hopes that they will earn. And in that case, of course, it's not so pleasant. This idea, obviously, well, it begins, I think, with the Egyptians. If you fail the negative confession, which I was talking about a moment ago, then you don't go to the field of reeds, although it seems that all that happens to you, and I say all, is that you're gobbled up by a hybrid monster called Amit, who is just waiting there to gobble you up in case you do fail the test. But after having been gobbled up, that's it. You don't suffer any particular pain or torture, everlasting punishment, nothing of that kind. That belief comes in much later. And also with the Greeks, who began to believe, probably in the 6th century BC, well, does it have to be everybody goes to this place of darkness? No. The mystery religions begin to introduce the idea that there will be a blessed existence for those who undergo initiation. Doesn't seem as if you need to be good. You just have to be initiated to learn certain things. And then Virgil, when he writes the 6th book of the Aeneid, he elaborates on the kind of tortures and pains that will be meted out to those who are wicked, sort of prefiguring Christianity in a way. Christianity being the religion, of course, which offers both the best in terms of heaven and the worst in terms of hell for the first time in human thinking. Although I would emphasize that in the Gospels, we hear very little about hell. We hear quite a bit about heaven. We hear about the separation of the good from the bad, the sheep from the lambs, or the goats from the lambs, I forget which it is, but very little about hell itself. That comes in much later, really, with the 2nd, 3rd centuries, Christian fathers and so forth, but it makes its fullest impact really in the Middle Ages. And for instance, in the when the Council of Florence is held in 1438, all non-Catholics go to hell. So really hell gathers steam quite a bit after the ministry of Christ, and even later than Paul as well, who does not mention Hades as a place of punishment at all either. So really religion and monotheism, one has to say, is what gives emphasis both to a afterlife, which is going to be full of joyfulness, but also one that promises as well very nasty things happening to you if you don't pass the test.
In either of those options, though, I'm not hearing any interactions with the living. Was there seen to be any sort of contact between the dead and the living, or is it, nope, once the process is done, then these realms are completely separate?
Well, no, of course, I think there is contact, hoped for contact between the living and the dead. And I think there is a natural human desire for a continuum of a relationship rather than rupture. And we see this actually I like to use this example, Athenian Greek gravestones, which show the dead and the living shaking hands. We don't know whether they're parting, we don't know whether they're meeting, but nonetheless, the continuation of a relationship, a family relationship between loved ones, is very, very central to the human psyche, I think. There's something like 80% of people who believe in an afterlife, I think my figures are derived from the US, believe that it will be a reunion between family members. And I might add, family pets as well. I was just reading a little note in a church which said, "Dear God, please may all good dogs go to heaven," which I thought was absolutely delightful. But apart from that, apart from the desire to continue, there is always unfinished business between the living and the dead. And a belief that the dead are dependent upon the living is very strong, that we need to do something to make their lives in the afterlife superior. And also the dead are powerful. And then there is sentimentality. So all these emotions are operating from a very early point in human history, I think. So, yes, the dead are dependent. And for instance, in Egypt, many people would have a Ka statue, Ka that is, which would be placed in the grave, which would receive food and drink. It would be placed inside what was called a serdab, which is a sort of enclosed space, but it would be able to smell the food and the drink that you left for it outside. Because the Egyptian dead, despite the fact that they had a hope that food and drink would be laid by their relatives, knew better than to think that they necessarily would. So they have images of loaves and beer, cans, etc., so to speak, painted onto the walls, in the belief, of course, magic has its own reality and that these things will come to life in the afterlife. So certainly dependency for food and drink was widely believed necessary for the dead to receive from the living. And that we call tomb cult. And it was also practiced, for instance, by the Greeks and by the Romans. So it was customary to leave food and drink on the tomb, which would no doubt have often been stolen by poor people. And no doubt they would have hung out particularly at ours, when they knew that there would be a deposit being made on a grave. So also in the Roman home, by the way, there was something called a lararium. That is to say, a place where the lares, the spirits of the dead, received a little sacrifice, perhaps each day. I think as well of the practice of laying flowers on a grave, as if we can contact the dead, as if the dead will be aware that they are being loved, cared for, thought of by the living. So the idea that the dead and the living are not by any means separated from each other entirely, I think is deeply ingrained in the human spirit. And whether or not we believe in an afterlife, I think it's a very important act, and one speaks to our humanity, in fact, that we do honor the dead in this way. I think despite all the lightheartedness I bring, I hope, to the subject, I profoundly believe in the deep humanity of honoring the dead.
I think that's perhaps a lovely place to end our discussion on the book. That's such a message that comes throughout the whole book, with the lightheartedness as well, going back to the point you made right at the beginning around we are alive now, and that's worth being aware of and appreciating through these discussions. So thank you for telling us, or at least a bit about the book. Obviously, there's loads of details for listeners to engage with themselves. But is there anything that you are working on now that this book is done, whether or not it's a book, whether or not it's on this topic, anything you want to give us a brief sneak preview of?
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm writing a book called Everything You've Always Wanted to Know About Sex and Love in the Ancient World, but weren't around to ask. So it's taking the same approach as this book, in that it's going through a number of different cultures in order to establish where there are points of commonality, points of difference, as you mentioned at the beginning, and to do so, again, as far as I can, in a fairly light-hearted manner, though actually sex and love aren't as light-hearted, in my view, as death is, because, of course, people do some terrible things. And those cannot be ignored, added to which there's the whole difference that still exists in terms of how men look at women, how they have regarded them from the beginning of time, so to speak, and in all cultures, I would say, to be inferior, etc., etc. And that is something that also pays in, of course, to the ways in which sex and love have operated in antiquity, and to some extent tragically do to this day. But it seemed to me a natural transition from death to move to sex and the afterlife. So I'm busily engaged in that also very large project, which I shall try to confine to not much more number of pages than the present book.
Yes, that definitely does sound like a lot of wrangling, but I'm sure you'll find all sorts of interesting things. So best of luck with that project. And of course, while you are doing it, listeners can read the book we've been discussing, titled What to Expect When You're Dead, An Ancient Tour of Death and the Afterlife, published by Princeton University Press in 2025. Robert, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Miranda, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.